Phillies Mailbag, our weekly look inside your questions. You can send questions to Frank Klose at Frank Klose with a K on Twitter, and he will answer your questions here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN, and he is here to do that now as Frank, this is the worst team maybe the Phillies have ever had. It's their worst, 49-game start in team history.
Yeah, it's not looking too good in terms of wins and losses. But really, as we knew going into this season, this season would not be judged necessarily by wins and losses. So I think that's something we need to remember.
Isn't this, though, I mean, we thought they were going to start getting closer to the 500 mark. Instead, they're taking steps backwards.
Yeah, in a few ways, we thought that the bullpen was going to be better, and then they had that really, really, really rough start. They're playing better a lot more now. They're being a lot more consistent now in the bullpen, but it seems like now then the starters are struggling, and the starters that we thought would be more stable as well. And we certainly didn't think the offense would fall off like this. We didn't think that Odubel Herrera would play like he's playing and Maikel Franco play like he's playing. So it's kind of unexpected in a lot of ways.
Speaking of the starters, let's dive into the mailbag here with Frank. Dan wants to know who is going to start for Zach Eflin, who got sent back to the minors. Are we going to be looking at Ben Lively, Nick Pivetta, somebody else?
I think early on, my initial reaction was that, Pivetta was pitching on Sunday, Eflin pitched on Sunday, Pivetta would come right in. I'm having a lot of doubts right now, maybe thinking that Ben Lively might get a shot, but I still tend to lean Nick Pivetta, and the reason I lean on Nick Pivetta, if you look at his numbers at AAA compared to Ben Lively's, they're both really, really good. You can make a case numbers-wise that both of them are deserving of an opportunity. But I think in some ways the Phillies have already started the process to sort of groom Nick Pivetta into being a major league starter. And while he didn't do that wonderfully in his time up in the major leagues, I think he's getting some of those initial lumps out of the way already. And the Phillies could actually continue to build on that if Pivetta came up and took this rotation spot. So one thing that Bob McClure said about Pivetta is that when he looks at a young pitcher, he looks at two innings. He looks at the first inning, how the pitcher deals with facing batters for the first time within a game, and then again at the fifth inning, and the fifth inning being when the pitcher is going to earn his first win. And if you look at Nick Pivetta's first handful of starts, that seems to be when he struggled. So was he putting a little too much pressure on himself when it came time for the fifth inning? That's something up for debate. Now, we also know that around the fifth inning, some of the hitters are going to see him a second or third time around. So that might have something to do with it. But I think at this point, they've already put those starts into Nick Pivetta's career. They have something they can continue to build on. That's why I tend to lean Pivetta. That and as of right now, and again, this could change, Pivetta is not scheduled to start on Friday. The Iron Pigs list a TBA for Friday's starter. And right now, again, could change, Ben Lively is scheduled to pitch on Thursday for the Iron Pigs. So that might give you a little indication. It could be absolutely nothing because they can change it at the very last minute. But I tend to think that the Phillies should kind of stick with Pivetta and try to see through his promotion.
Frank Klose with us. Frank, with Eflin being sent down, a two-parter for you. Number one, what does Eflin need to work on? And number two, are you discouraged with what you saw from him?
Yeah, Eflin seemed to have things get a little away from him. Somebody who relied a lot on pitches that sunk, a sinker ball pitcher, his pitches were staying right up and over the middle of the plate. So we kind of saw a little bit of whiplash the last couple starts that Eflin had, just because so many of the balls he was pitching were being left up, and they were just being knocked right out of the ballpark. So they were these big fat meatballs in the middle of the plate for that any major league hitter could seem to drive a long way. So that really seems to be just about it, making sure his sinkers are working. He's not leaving the ball flattened over the plate to be hit out. And I didn't think his time up was necessarily terrible, but certainly there are some things like that Eflin's kind of got to get under control before he can come up. And I still think he's promising, and there's no reason to panic per se, but I think, too, Eflin's demotion had a lot to do with the fact that they needed a roster spot for Howie Kendrick, and at the same time they had pitchers at AAA that could easily just come up and do just as well. So the circumstances were different. If they had 4 starters firing on all cylinders, if they didn't need somebody to be added to the roster, they might have approached it very differently and just sort of let them work out these things at the major league level. But in the situation they're in, the struggling nature of the team right now, I think they decided to give somebody else a shot.
We'll stay with the starting pitching in the mailbag. Faust wants to know, who do you think is the Phillies' most reliable starter? Are there any of these pitchers that are going to be a long-term part of the Phillies rebuild?
It's funny because everybody that was in this rotation to start the season seemed to be a stabilizing force. You know, we thought that Jeremy Hellickson would be a little bit more consistent in his approach going into this year. And in fact, at the end of April, we definitely would have said Jeremy Hellickson for this response, no doubt about it. But Hellickson, after going 4-0 in April, with a 1.80 ERA, he is now pitching over 7 ERA in May, and with a 1-3 record. And I was looking at his month by month breakdown over his career, and he hasn't had a month this bad since September of 2014. So this is a very uncharacteristic month for Hellickson. He'll kind of find his groove again. I mean, even when Hellickson wasn't having some of his better seasons, he usually didn't pitch this poorly in 1 month. So you got to think he's going to turn it around. But if I'm forced to pick somebody, I would still say Aaron Nola is the most reliable starter at the moment. At least when he gave up 5 runs in that last loss he had, he did go 6 innings. And I think the Phillies can at least count on him not to have a total meltdown of a start. That said, I still think very, very highly of Jared Eickhoff. Eickhoff is seemingly fiddling with his fastball command a little bit. That's kind of what gave him his success last year. He's trying to throw some of his other pitches instead, like his curveball, which, you know, kind of shows he's not very confident in his fastball. And I think that's something that he can work through eventually. Because if you remember, last season, he was very, very much consistent, very, very reliable for 6 or 7 innings. But just lately, Eickhoff has struggled, and really it's only been about 4 bad starts that have kind of contributed to his season kind of looking kind of grim. And remember, he's also pitched 7-inning, 2-run games that he's lost as well in this early going. So I think he can be a stabilizing force going forward. And certainly of these young pitchers, you would think that, you know, we could go on and on about the Pivettas and Liveleys and Eflins on this team. Really, hopefully, one of those guys or 2 of those guys will kind of fit in at the end of the rotation when things go on in the future. The Phillies acquire an ace pitcher, you would hope that they would do, and they keep talking about how they're going to spend the money. So I think the Phillies are going to grab an ace-type pitcher, maybe a solid number 2, and hopefully the combination of these guys are going to fill in behind that, and that's even considering what ultimately happens with Vince Velasquez, as we've spoken about so many times.
All right, Harry wants to know, will Hoskins, Williams, Quinn, somebody be up in the next month? I tweeted out this weekend, I think the team has won, 21 of their last 23 games at AAA. What more do those guys need to prove down there?
Right, and you essentially tweeted that out as well. So with 21 wins out of 23 games, I mean the Iron Pigs are just one of the hottest teams in all of professional baseball right now, and they're doing it on the backs of really like 5 or 6 position players that are legitimate prospects. Now, Harry asked about a few of them, so I'll kind of talk about them one by one. Now, the one that seemed to be the most consistent at AAA, that would be Rhys Hoskins. But the problem with Rhys Hoskins right now is that he is blocked by Tommy Joseph. Now, a month ago, I remember speaking to you on the air, and we're looking around, and Tommy Joseph is batting 179. And to Pete Maccannon's credit, he said, no, we've got to give him 100 at-bats before we can really tell the full story. Well, guess what? Tommy Joseph started kicking his play up a notch at that point. And if you look at his numbers today, you know, they don't look that great, you know, hitting around the 250 mark. But when you consider the month of May, if you just isolate that from that horrible April, he's batting .310 in May, and he has 7 home runs and 17 RBI in the month of May. And that's with not a lot of getting on base in front of him with those 17 RBI. So you think that Joseph now is their hottest hitter, and luckily they did wait him out, and I think that's going to block Hoskins from otherwise coming up. And Hoskins is playing very, very well, batting .315, and he's got no PS over 1 at this point. It's 50 games in, but you know what? If Joseph had a May like he had April, I think we would be talking about that. You know, you look at Nick Williams, who was just named International Batter of the Week. You know, he's certainly red hot. He's got 7 home runs in his last 10 games. You know, he's batting .351 in that span. And the thing about Williams, though, is he's kind of been up and down early in the season. So early in the season, he was hitting for average, not much power. Then he kind of dipped the average down, and you didn't see much of each for a little while. But now he's red hot. But I think before the Phillies go to Williams, he's going to have to show over an extended period of time that he can be consistent with his play, even with this nice stretch. And then in terms of Roman Quinn, I think he's having the best all-around season so far among those players he named. And the thing about Quinn is he's got a struggling Odubel Herrera ahead of him in the major leagues. And the Phillies, you know, they're giving him a second night off in a row, as we heard in that update a moment ago. You know, but if he can't turn it around, Quinn, he's been very well-rounded. Now, he's been hitting in the 270s-ish lately, but he's been stealing bases. He's been hitting doubles. He has a few triples in there, and he's walking and getting on base at a .344 clip, where Odubel Herrera right now is getting on base in the low 2s, and that just can't happen if you're going to be somebody who's going to be counted on to bat second in your lineup, where the Phillies were actually batting Odubel Herrera third, but Roman Quinn's the type of player that could come up and bat behind Cesar Hernandez, and you got 2 switch hitting players that get on base ahead of your number 3-hole hitter, and that's going to lead to a lot of success. So, but Quinn coming up is contingent upon whether or not the Phillies are willing to make a decision on Odubel Herrera. He's not going to really displace Altair right now, and between Saunders and Kendrick, you know, the other position is kind of tied up at the moment too. But so I don't think he's playing well enough to force their hand, but Odubel Herrera might force their hand for the Phillies. And I just want to add that Dylan Cousins is also having a very, very nice May, batting .319, and he had a very poor April, and he might be somebody who applies some pressure later if he's batting consistently. But right now, Roman Quinn seems to be the most consistent one at AAA. And I think until there's an opening for him, we're not going to see him.
Hey, let me ask you this question. If there was one guy, you know, last year Tommy Joseph just forced them. He played his way onto the team. Is there a guy who is doing that now that you say, yes, this guy is playing his way where the Phillies have to take notice now?
Well, I think one difference between Joseph last year and what the situation is now, last year with Joseph, you had Darren Ruff kind of in that right-handed first baseman role, and Darren Ruff really wasn't hitting a lick. So there was a clear landing spot for Joseph when that happens. Now, if this was last year and Rhys Hoskins was that guy at first base at AAA, I think that would be a situation where he could force their hand. But right now, there really is no desperate need in some respects to bring that player right up. Even though some of the players on the field are maddeningly frustrating, there's just no sense of urgency like there might have been before with Joseph, and Darren Ruff is just killing you from the right side. So I think a few other shoes need to drop before we see a lot of these players. Howie Kendrick, as we've seen in the little bit we've got to see him, he's a nice professional hitter. Michael Saunders, they don't want to totally kill his trade value by not playing him, and they're spending a good chunk of change on him. So again, Joseph is having a heck of a May. So there's just not a lot of openings for players to come up, and maybe if Aaron Altair wasn't playing the way he was, they would find a place for Roman Quinn. But right now, it's just really hard for the Phillies to find room. And if the Phillies do create some space and bring them all up, what happens if they fail? And there's really no recourse from that.
All right, Frank Klose, the mailbag opened. A lot of interesting questions this week, and I think as this team continues to sputter, it has been tough to watch. A lot of people want to see some changes. We'll see if the Phillies budge on that. At Frank Klose with a K on Twitter, the Phillies mailbag every week at this time. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, guys.